بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Inshallah, today we'll be moving on to the next letter, which is the letter Dhaal. So the things we will discuss is number one, how is a Dhaal pronounced, like always. Then we'll discuss the Dhaal, how is it pronounced when it's Mutaharrik and when it's Sakin. And finally, a common error that does happen when pronouncing a da, especially in the Indian subcontinent. That means India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all those areas. There's an error that many of them make regarding this specific letter. So let's move forward, inshallah. First is, how is the letter dal pronounced? So when we're thinking of this letter dal, have the letter tha in your mind, because tha and dal are very, very similar in terms of where they're pronounced from. So the letter Dhaal is produced when contact is made between two parts. Number one, the front part of the tongue and the edges of the upper teeth. So over here, we have the front part of the tongue and the edges of the upper teeth are right here. So this tongue is making contact right over here with the bottom edges of the upper teeth. And that's exactly how a tha is pronounced as well. And similar to the letter tha, the tongue has to come out a bit when pronouncing this letter. So just a bit, not too much, is a very small amount, but a part of the tongue, a very small bit, must be out of the mouth. If it stays inside, then the letter will not be pronounced properly. So that tongue goes below the upper teeth, and then the sound is made. You kind of bite on it too to make dhal. So if you actually take your tongue and put it between the upper and bottom teeth, and then you try to make the sound, it'll come out as dhal. If you only let air come out, a tha will come out. But if you make a sound come out, a dhal will come out instead. So now let's move forward to how do you pronounce a mutaharrik and a sakin dhal. So when dhal has a harakah, very straightforward, you release the tongue from that area. And then after that, you make the motion for whichever haraka you're talking about. So you have your tongue on the bottom of those teeth. Then when you make the sound, you release it. And then you make the fatha dhamma kasra sound. For example, the word dhabahu. So you start off with your tongue underneath the upper teeth. And then dhabahu. Then with the dhamma, a'udhu. A'udhu. So dhu. Third one with the kasra, hadhihi. So we have the, dhu, and the. When that is sakin, in that case, the tongue is going to remain on the edges of the upper teeth. It's not going. You're going to keep it in that exact area when you're pronouncing a dhal that is sakin. For example, id. So it stays there. Id, wa id qala. Or next word with the fatha before it is tadhbahu. So it stays there. Tadhbahu. I'm stretching it. You're not supposed to stretch it, but just for the example. Tadhbahu. And then with the dhamma before the second dal. Khudh. So id, tad, khudh. So the dal stays on that place. You do not release it from the area because, like I mentioned before, there are a group of letters that where you do release them, alif, jim, ajidu, qatin, dal, qaf, ta, ba, kaf, and ta. Those are the letters where you have to release them when they're sakin, but for the rest of the letters, majority of them, you do not release them when they are sakin. So that's the simple explanation of a dhal mutaharrik and a dhal that's sakin. Now let's move on to the next part, which is a common error that happens regarding the letter zal. And it's very similar to the error that happened in the letter tha. What is that? That the Urdu zal is not the Arabic zal. They are two completely different letters. And to be precise, if you use the Urdu zal in Arabic, you're actually going to make a different letter and the meaning of the Quran will change. So in Urdu, a dha is pronounced by placing the tongue along the back of the lower teeth. And when you do that, you end up producing a sound that's similar to a za or a z. That's the sound that comes out. That's why it's called a zal. Your tongue is actually somewhat touching the the bottom teeth, and a bit of it might be kind of hugging the upper gums as well, but generally speaking, the tongue is on the bottom teeth. So that's a z sound. So in Urdu, that's why they call it dal and zal with a z, zal. In Arabic, though, in order to pronounce a da, a small portion of the front of the tongue has to actually come out of the mouth. So when the Urdu zal is pronounced, the tongue is inside the mouth and it's actually touching the bottom teeth. But when the Arabic zal is pronounced, the tongue is a bit out of the mouth. It's actually a bit out of the actual mouth. It's not inside, it's a bit out of the entire mouth. So if the top tip of the tongue is kept inside the mouth, what will happen, and you try to pronounce this letter, what's going to happen is the tongue will go down and will create the sound of a Urdu da, instead Urdu zal, a z sound, instead of the Arabic dal. So dal requires a bit of the tongue to be outside of the mouth, just a small tip, and the Urdu zal requires the tongue to be inside the mouth and towards the bottom. So those are two completely different letters. So the Arabic dal should not be confused with the Urdu zal. The Urdu zal is like a za, right? Zazi. That's completely different. In the Quran, it's what is, not what is. Right? What is, not what is, it's what is. It's dhalika, not zalika. All of those words, if you say with a za, then that's a completely different word, which may have its own meaning. And that is one common error that does happen in the Indian subcontinent. So inshallah, we'll end off here today. And tomorrow, we'll move on to a slightly tougher letter, which is the letter